Hello, everybody. So today I want to look at the what was this role of the Posek at the time of Jesus? What would that look like? Well, it helps then to know some important things, right? So the Talmud. So the Talmud is something that's created. It becomes put into place in about the second century A.D. But rabbis will tell you that no, it's always been there. It's part of the oral law given to Moses. It was given to Moses at that time. At the same time, they got the written law, and then he taught other men, and so those men then worked with the law and they taught other people, and then it was handed down all this time. And it was never intended to be written down until after the time of the Babylonian exile, when Judaism began to spread beyond the land out into the rest of the world. And so what they needed was something that codified these decisions, so that Judaism was practiced consistently and the law was applied consistently wherever they happened to be. So you've got two Talmuds, by the way. There's a Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, and the one that is probably most revered is the Babylonian Talmud. The best scholars were conceded to be in Babylon. They didn't want to come back to the land, and so the one most often cited is the Babylonian Talmud. So what you get then in the Talmud is a question being raised and then rabbinic opinion about it. And it's not many rabbis that are cited in this. There's a bunch that are regularly cited, and they would have been the experts. They would have been the poseks, and they can disagree with one another. And the Talmud is attempting to bring you both those arguments and sort of the general consensus of which of those should be followed. And they can deviate really dramatically. I mean, for instance, in the idea of a divorce, for instance, that there's a question, and so there's two rabbinic schools at the time of Jesus. That's Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Well, one of those is much more lenient, so it loosed more than the other. So it would be on that particular issue. It could be she burned the dinner is enough to find fault. The other will say, I think it's more like adultery that qualifies. I mean, that's how wide they can diverge from one another. So at any rate, that's then becomes the way that the arguments get played out. And so then there's sort of a consensus around this is the way that it ought to be applied, but they preserve the minority opinion. So what happens then with this whole thing, this Posek position? So if you think about American law, for instance, what you get is you get the law, and then you have case law. So when you go to court with something, what your lawyer would do was they would cite the governing authority, and then they would cite case law that supports their interpretation of the law. That's what it is. That's exactly what we're talking about here. So this Posek person, remember, that's the authority that's given to Peter. That's the authority given to Peter when he makes the confession of Jesus. So this Posek person, it becomes the person who is the expert in the law, but there are multiple experts in the law. There are multiple Poseks. And so these people are cited as the primary sources for how to interpret something in a given situation. So at the time of Jesus, or right after the time of Jesus, probably the greatest one of these appears, and his name is Rabbi Akiva. And so the story is told, and it's obviously not true, but that Moses goes up to the top of the mountain to get the law from God, and God is busily sitting there putting little crowns and things over the letters. So Moses says, "What are you doing?" And this is delaying the giving of the law. Does this matter? And God says, "Not to you, but there's going to be a guy later who's going to go through these, and he's going to discover all kinds of laws in the little crowns, in the things that are the vowelization and the breath marks and stuff like that." So he says, "Can I see this guy?" He shows him. He says, "Turn around," and he turns around, and suddenly he's in a classroom now, thousands of years later, and he's listening to this rabbi teaching. He doesn't understand anything, and Moses is just devastated by this and said, "Why are you even bothering to give the law to me when you got a guy like this?" He said, "No, keep listening." Somebody asked him a question, "Where did you get all this?" And he said, "I got it when Moses was handed it at Sinai." So he's standing on the shoulders of Moses. He's not going outside. He's applying it in his situation. And so that's kind of how it worked at the time of Jesus. That's where the Talmud comes from. Those people who are cited in the Talmud are people who would be poseks. So at any rate, that's how important they are in Judaism. They're the people who decide disputes concerning the law. They're the ones who are considered expert, and it's not just in the law, but I mean literally, it's every jot and tittle, like Jesus says that he's going to be until every jot and tittle is taken care of. So he's going to fulfill the entire law, including those little jots and tittles. And so now tomorrow we'll look a little bit about how this looks after Jesus commissions Peter with this. What does it look like going forward?